Hey, hello everyone. My name is Eric Maslowski, and in this tutorial we're going to be continuing the 101 series by taking a look at maps, or more specifically, taking images and applying them to your object as textures. So if you open up 3D Studio Max and go and create a simple sphere in the middle of your scene, then if you go and open up the material editor by pressing M on the keyboard, or using the icon on the toolbar. Now, previously we went over what diffuse colors are, how to set them, and also how to apply a material to an object by clicking and dragging it. We also went over such things as specular highlights and transparency and self-illumination. So right now what we want to do is we want to try to just assign an image, let's say a brick pattern, to this sphere here. So an easy way to do that is if directly to the right of diffuse you notice the little box. This little box is reserved for maps. So if we click on it, it lists all the different types of maps that we can apply to this channel, or to the diffuse channel. So a bitmap is a standard rasterized image, like a JPEG, a GIF, etc. Further down, you see we have cellular, checker, combustion, composites, and so on. All of these are what are called procedural textures. And by procedural, I mean that they get their appearance based off of parameters instead of just an image. So let's first just start with the simple bitmap. Okay, so if we double click on bitmap, find our way to the maps directory that comes with 3D Studio Max, go to the brick subdirectory, and let's choose one, brick yellow. Alright, so we can now see the brick texture on our material side, but we can't see it on our object. We can change this by clicking on the little blue and white checkered cube right underneath our material slots. So we click on that, we now see the effect on our sphere. Now, we can change the scaling, the tiling, and so on by using these options underneath coordinates. Now, one thing to keep in mind though is if you're exporting your objects to, say, a real-time engine or to another package, I highly recommend avoiding this and using UV coordinates instead. The difference between this and UV coordinates is that UV coordinates are specific to the object itself. These right here are specific to the material. And so sometimes when you're exporting, these settings won't transfer over. So use them, use them cautiously. But if they'll save you time and you know all the caveats surrounding their use, by all means use them. Now, we'll leave most of these as defaults for right now. If we look underneath bitmap parameters, next to bitmap, we can see the image or the file name that we chose. We can click on it again to choose a different one. So I'm going to choose the red brick, and you can see everything updates appropriately. If you need to, you can always reload the texture. So say you make a modification somewhere else and for some reason it didn't update in here, you can always click reload and it'll try to load it back into memory. Now, if I took this file, like the brick texture, and brought it into Photoshop, made some changes, and saved it out, 3D Studio Max periodically checks all of its resources. So if the modified date for this texture is newer than the one that it has loaded in memory, it will automatically reload your texture. So it's really nice to just be able to save it in Photoshop, jump back into Max, and then see the results. Now, a couple other options worth noting for the introduction to textures and bitmaps in particular is right over here, the cropping placement. If we click on View Image, we get to see our texture. Now you'll also notice that we have these little boxes. And what we can do is we can specify an area of the texture that we're interested in. So say I'm only really interested in these 2 bricks. Okay, so a very, very small subset of our texture. Close this down. And we can click on Apply. And you can see that it's stretched that brick, those 2 bricks, to fit the entire sphere. Okay, so what will happen is this will be kind of like a 1-to-1 correlation of your mapping coordinates on here. So it stretches it to fit the entire sphere or the entire object. Now, in addition to this, underneath Output, we can do just some very basic operations. Now you may notice that these operations don't carry over into the viewport. However, if we go ahead and render it, it does show up. We can adjust the output amount. We can also adjust the RGB offset, which basically shifts what the center gray value or the midtone is. The RGB level, we can increase or decrease, so oversaturate it or desaturate it. If you choose an HDR image for your bitmap here, you often want to set the RGB level to the exposure level or the white level of your HDR image. And we'll go over that in a future tutorial, more specifically lighting tutorial. Okay, and so these are the main ones I wanted to point out for right now. Now, materials in maps are basically related in a hierarchical fashion. If we go over to the Material Map Navigator on the right-hand side of our material slots and click on that, we can clearly see our hierarchy. So we basically have a map which is assigned to the diffuse color, and then above that we have a standard material. And we can click on either one of these to jump back and forth. Now we also have the option to do the same in this drop-down list, but this will only show one section, or like one tree, or one branch of our tree. So we can jump back and forth with the drop-down list. Now, again, because this is a hierarchy, this map is a child of this material. So you'll notice right above the bitmap word here that there's a little up arrow, and this will take us to our parent. So that's the third way that you can navigate back and forth between different levels. Okay, so here we have a very simple texture applied to our sphere. Now let's take a look at a couple other types of maps that we can apply. So further down on your main material section, you'll see a little tab called Maps. Now if you expand that, you'll see all the different categories that we can assign maps to. So right now we have one set to diffuse color, and it's currently set to 100%. If we decrease that, you'll notice that the base color, or the diffuse color that we set up here, starts to show through. So for right now, I'm just going to give it a slight orange tint. And then further down, you'll notice bump at 30%. If we click on where it says none, again, we get our list of maps. Choose noise. You can see it gives a pseudo detailing look. Okay, so this is a really efficient way to add detail to your object without having to modify it or model it. So if we assign this to our object, you see that not much changes. If we render it, again, not much changes. So what we want to do is we want to show this map in the viewport. Now you can only show one map per material in the viewport at any one time. So now we'll just decrease the size until things start to look a little bit better. And especially when dealing with the noise procedural texture, I highly recommend you render often. So keep your finger on the F9 key. Okay, so there we go. We just got a little bumps. Now, directly to the left of our Go to Parent button, you see that we have this Show Result, which is very similar to this one right there in our modifier stack. So if we turn that off, we get a flat representation of our noise texture. And so we can now go through and change these to try to get a different particular look. We can also see the effect in our viewports. So we're going to turn it back on, do a quick render. There we go, a nice noisy texture. Now one thing to note about the noise procedural map is that we have our two colors down here. By default it's set to black and white. So white will be the highest point, black will be the lowest point. However, what we can do is we can actually assign another texture to either one of these channels. So let's just say we go to bitmap and we'll choose one that has a really nice, there we go, some nice contrast to it. Now you'll notice that it ends up showing through there. So if we go back to our noise, only see this, and let's just make our size much larger just for a second. And so what you'll see here is that it basically blends the two results. So the white is still showing through, but the black is being replaced by the texture that we chose. So you can get a lot of flexibility by mixing and matching maps in here. So we'll just drop this all the way back down and take a look at our render. So we see a little bit of the noise and we see a little bit of the brick. Okay, so let's jump back up and let's add selective transparency. Now remember, transparency is done through the opacity channel right here. We can uniformly decrease it or increase it. But what we want to do is we want to control the transparency with a bitmap. So if we go to none next to opacity, and actually instead of a bitmap we're going to choose checker. So if we just click on checker, you'll see that it makes part of it completely opaque and the other part completely transparent. If we turn on our background, it becomes a little bit clearer. So now if we view this one in our viewport, and let's change this a little bit. There we go. Click render. Parts of it become transparent and parts of it become completely opaque. If I go ahead and change my background color to something very noticeable, there you go. Now all of these procedural textures can be used in any one of these slots. So I can use a standard bitmap down in bump, I can use a noise up in diffuse color, and to demonstrate this we're just going to click and drag our bump map up to our diffuse color. It asks us if we want to instance it, copy it, or swap it. Now instance will create kind of like a two-way communication. So if we modify one, it'll modify the other. If we do a copy, it's just going to make a completely unique copy of this noise procedural. And then swap will change those two places. So we're going to actually do swap. We're going to turn off opacity. So you can see now we have yellow brick for our diffuse color with those white spots in it. And then we just have a really bad bump map that's pretty hard to see because we only had those 2 bricks set up. Now, one other thing that you can do, which is fairly useful with maps, is you can right-click on a map and copy it. Then you can go over to a new material, right-click on section, and paste it. So there's a really quick way of jumping back and forth between different different maps that you've created. Now, the primitives in 3D Studio Max automatically come with mapping coordinates. So Max already knows by default when you create a primitive how to assign an image to it. In the next tutorial, what we'll end up doing is we'll show how you can actually assign those mapping coordinates, or how you can modify the mapping coordinates that are already there. Well, that'll basically do it for an introduction to maps. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or post on the forums. Thank you.